right. Good morning and welcome to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm Eric Charmella, Senior Fellow in the Russia-Eurasia program here in Washington. Yesterday marked the 3-year anniversary of Russia's criminal invasion of Ukraine. Over the past 36 months, we've all watched in awe as the Ukrainian people have bravely defended their country and democracy. Ukraine has enjoyed significant support from its partners in the United States and Europe, but the past few weeks have seen radical changes in U.S. policy, most notably the launching of a U.S.-Russia negotiating process without Ukraine and Europe at the table. These changes foreshadow some challenging and dynamic times ahead. Today's event is a special one for a few reasons. We're going to explore the war and the state of diplomacy through an unconventional framing that focuses on Ukraine's relationship with China, which has positioned itself as a neutral party despite providing significant support to Russia over the past 3 years. Here to unpack the complicated Chinese-Ukrainian relationship are two eminent scholars. Pavlo Klimkin is a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment and served as Ukraine's foreign minister from 2014 to 2019 during the first phase of Russia's war against Ukraine. Pavlo is a seasoned diplomat who, in his retirement, continues to travel the world making the case that support for Ukraine's right to defend itself is in the interests of international peace and security. We're also joined by Dr. Zhao Long, Deputy Director of the Institute for International Strategic Security Studies and Senior Research Fellow at the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. Long is one of China's foremost experts on Russia, Ukraine, and the wider region. We're honored to have both Pavlo and Long here in person. Moderating today's discussion is Ellen Nakashima, national security reporter for The Washington Post. You've no doubt read much of Ellen's stellar reporting on intelligence and national security issues. Thank you, Ellen, for being here with us today. And one final note about today's unique event. Although we're here in Washington, this event is actually part of the Carnegie Global Dialogues run by Carnegie China, our East Asia-based research center. This 12-year-old event series brings experts from Carnegie centers around the world to discuss issues related to China's evolving international role. For more information about Carnegie China and its excellent work, please visit carnegiechina.org. And with that, let's begin the discussion.
Thank you. Hello, am I on? Thank you, Eric, and Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for hosting this today. I am not an expert on the Ukraine-China relationship, so I'm looking forward to exploring that today and learning a lot from our panelists. As Eric mentioned, we just passed the 3-year anniversary of the war yesterday. Remember 3 years ago, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping stood on the opening day of the Beijing Olympics and declared their no-limits partnership. Then 3 weeks later, Russia mounted its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. China has indeed stood by Russia, furnishing a lot of critical components that support the Russian war machine. And yesterday, President Xi, in a call with Putin, reaffirmed the China's support for Russia, calling the two countries true friends. So Russia's partnership with China is well known, but in fact, we don't know a lot about China's evolving relationship with Ukraine and the strategic implications of that for China, Ukraine, Europe, and the US. I think most people don't know, in fact, that China and Ukraine have had a strategic partnership since 2011. And at one point, China was indeed the largest foreign investor in Ukraine. And so, Long, why don't you start by briefly describing for us the partnership China has had with Ukraine dating back before the war, and what role you see China play in perhaps ending the war or participating in post-war reconstruction?
Yeah, well, first of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Eric and Ellen, for hosting this event. It's really happened for Chinese experts together with our Ukraine colleagues, sit together and discuss this issue. As you mentioned, Ukraine is one of the strategic partner of China, like Russia. But unfortunately, after the outbreak of the war, we call it Ukraine crisis, somehow the relationship between with Ukraine and with Russia being posted or positioned as some kind of a mutually conflicting to each other. But I don't think this is reflect the reality because we really value our partnership with Ukraine. Ukraine joined the Belt and Road Initiative in 2017, and we maintained our growth in bilateral trade. I think last year there will be in total $8 billion US dollars, although the size is not really significant, but I want to mention or emphasize on the dynamic. There is still 17% of year-to-year increase. So basically, there's a lot of ongoing projects with Chinese investment in Ukraine. It's regarding the port facilities, the Kiev's metro lines, and many others. But I have to admit that China's engagement with Ukraine in terms of economic cooperation and trade has been really disrupted by the war, by the crisis. And the Chinese companies are really reluctant to go back in the background of this war. So this is why precisely I think China is interested in the peace, in restoring the peace in Ukraine, because it's really related to our interest, the interest of our enterprises and the interest of China in general. So there's quite some speculations, even debate about China's role in the peace process. But I would say this, China is neither the instigator or the direct participant of the war, of the crisis, but China was one of the major victims of the spillover effect of the war. So that's why I think, of course, China wants to be the part of solution to restore the peace. However, I think we should really take a more pragmatic view on China's role in this regard. I think personally, I believe that there's at least 3 areas that China could play a role. The first one, there will be providing platforms for dialogue and negotiation. So China really interested in convening dialogues among all stakeholders that are involved. This is one. And secondly, I think Beijing will likely approach any role of so-called security guarantee issue very cautiously, because this. Maybe I will not rule out this possibility entirely, but I think the only reason here is it's not, this kind of involvement does not align with our traditions, our policy practices. China never provide such similar security guarantee to other countries. And I think it's really, Beijing would face a significant challenge. Let's assume the war start again, reemerge again, and it will somehow involve China's overseas military activities, which is really sensitive for us. And instead, I think China may be interested in discuss of peacekeeping operations, but only under the UN framework. And while I think we had vast experiences in the UN peacekeeping missions around the world, I think this is something that could be discussed and also could be, extended to exploring using of emerging technologies such as drones, surveillance equipment to monitoring the peace or ceasefire. So I think China will be also interested in open discussion about establishment of some kind of a mechanism of monitoring the ceasefire together with other participants, mainly from the global South countries. That will be also the possible topic for discussion. But finally, I think given the China's vast experience in infrastructure, so the post-war reconstruction, China could play a certain role in that direction, but I don't think it remains quite premature until the ceasefire mechanisms are firmly in place. So I would generalize China's role with very open-minded and positive, manner. And I think it's really depends on the situation in the future, especially the outcome from the President Trump, the President Putin's negotiation. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Long. That was really interesting. And let's turn to Pavlo now. There's a lot here that Long mentioned that you might want to pick up on. But I'd like you to address what you see as the fundamental issue here at play for Ukraine in terms of its relationship with China, and what interests or opportunities, especially given what Long said, do you see here for China that can be leveraged towards a just outcome for Ukraine? I'll note that in Munich, we were just talking about that earlier, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi noted that healthy China-Europe relations are needed now more than ever after the US initiated peace talks with Russia, but without Europe or Ukraine. So, Pavlo?
Thanks, Alan, and thanks, Eric, for getting us back into the Carnegie Gazette crowd. It's good to have such discussions with colleagues and friends. It was actually myself many years ago as a humble deputy foreign minister overseeing this. Not the whole batch of negotiations, but part of negotiations about strategic partnership between Ukraine and China. Mm-hmm. I was not in charge directly of our bilateral relations, but I was in charge of what is normally called security-related issues. And even then, the issue was what would it actually mean to have a strategic partnership between Ukraine and China, beyond all kind of playing with good definition. So why are they strategic? What is their strategic character? And I would love to come back to this issue now after all these years and to try to understand or to figure out what would it mean to feel this definition with value, added value, with substance, and with understanding how we can drive the strategic relations. It's my first point. The second, many years ago, even 10 years ago, the majority of Chinese scholars, and our colleague would correct me if I am wrong, actually saw Ukraine as the reality belonging to the Russian sphere of influence. Actually, many scholars who were Russian-speaking, had experience in the Soviet Union, were dealing also with Ukraine. So Ukraine was not considered part of Europe. Something between buffer reality and Russian sphere of influence. It was a fundamental sense where Ukraine belongs. And the moment we're going to start talking about what it means to have a new sense of this strategic partnership. And my point, it presents a real opportunity for us, for Ukrainians, but also for China. And I'm going to explain it a bit later. So we need to understand how China now perceives Ukraine, whether it's part of Europe or future part of Europe in the sense of institutional framework or so, or rather a kind of buffer, because belonging to the Russian sphere of influence, it's what I hear from many Chinese scholars, is clearly over. Mm-hmm. So it's a fundamental overhaul, fundamental game changer in how China should, for me, approach Ukraine. Third, and it's again a great opportunity for me, for China to engage or not to engage. Mm-hmm. With all kind of discussions, with Europe having let me say it, not really politically correct, sort of schizophrenic position on China. It's a sort of definition where China is the same way, partner, rival. I mean, you know this thread. So fundamentally, nobody understands how to begin with anything practical coming from this definition. And with Europe now lost in translation, I mean, having new administration here in Washington, understanding what to do, how to deliver on European security, it could be, it should not be, but it could be a fundamentally new set of opportunities for China in building up different links and relations to Europe. I mean, not to European countries. Mm-hmm. Let me stress it, but to Europe as such. And it's a big point for China now to answer this question. What would it mean for China to build these relations with Europe? It was always, how I understand the Chinese strategy, a sort of priority to build a different track of relations to Europe, not just to the West as such, but to Europe. And now the chance is there. Fourth point. What my colleague has just described here, it's really, I like this point, because it's up to China to decide now whether to use the opportunity to start talking about European security. It was never ever the case in the history of Chinese foreign policy. But if China decides to start talking, it comes with some sense of risk, opportunities, and obligation. It's a kind of tricky mixture. But if you go for it, I mean, the opportunities could be, but the risks are always there because you have to deliver. And it's a very simple point. If China is there, not only in the sense of providing platforms or formats, but also engaging in Ukraine and around Ukraine as a future part of Europe, it could fundamentally change the perception of China, because during this full-scale invasion, the perception of China in Ukraine has clearly deteriorated, because Ukrainians believe, yes, China has not been delivering little weapons, but the support for the war is there. But it's not getting totally negative. So, I mean, it's reversible. I mean, it's psychologically reversible. And it's a fundamental point Beijing should take into account considering any sort of future set of ideas, action, and scenarios.
Pablo, I think you've set up some very interesting points that I'd like, before we turn to Eric, I'd like you, Long, to just address directly about whether China sees or could see Ukraine as part of Europe, EU, Europe, and what steps might China be willing to take to show that it is supportive of Ukraine in that sense? And I note that you talked about being willing to send peacekeeping troops in. What about perhaps supporting a sort of an explicit declaration in the UN Security Council supporting European forces in Ukraine? Certain things like that. Where do you think you can see China actually?
Well, in fact, I think Pablo correctly mentioned that there was a reality that in certain period of time, given to the history, when Beijing regard Ukraine really as a part of so-called post-Soviet Union space, because it happens to related to the languages, the knowledge, the history that we have been perceived from the almost 70 plus years of Soviet Union. So that's why I've been to Kyiv in 2007. That's quite a long time ago. During that time, in our Chinese embassy, the majority diplomats were Russian speakers, diplomats. So this is the reality. But I think now there are some significant changes, even adaptations from China to consider the overwhelmingly formed consensus of Ukrainian people, whether they regarding themselves as a part of Europe or to go back to the so-called post-Soviet Union space. So I think it's really up to Ukrainian people to decide, but I think Beijing will recognize any direction that Ukrainian government is following. And as I also mentioned that this is the real opportunity for Beijing to consider normalizing our relations with Europe, with European countries, of course, but with Europe as a whole. I think in the past 3 years, the China-Europe relations really been hijacked by this conflict and this war. The Chinese image has been severely damaged among the European societies. And some political figures even claim that the whole future of China-Europe relations will depend on our relationship with Russia. So I don't think it's fair to accuse China in such a bluntly way. But I think we really don't. We really try to balance the concerns for all parties, including Europe, Russia, and Ukraine. And I think there's a great opportunity for us to generalize or normalize our relations with Europe if there will be ceasefire in place. Yeah.
So, Eric, with the votes in the UN yesterday, what President Trump's, his call with Putin recently, and what he said of President Zelensky, it's becoming evident that it's sort of Ukraine and Europe versus the US and Russia in this geopolitical environment. And with that changed dynamic, how do you think Moscow views the prospect of Beijing's involvement in the negotiations? Does it welcome China's engagement as another potential major ally in the effort, or does it see potential pitfalls? How do you think they see it?
Thanks, Ellen. I mean, as you noted, the deck has really been reshuffled in the last few weeks, and we see this very unexpected sort of alignment of the United States and Russia against Ukraine, and Europe with China somewhere in between. Over the past 3 years, the Russians have largely seen China as, an enabling factor when it comes to issues of diplomacy, as just sort of standing back and supporting Russian positions in a broad sense, but also giving China some leeway to present itself a little bit more neutrally when it comes to votes in the UN and some of its diplomacy in the international stage. We had the Chinese-Brazilian peace plan at some point a couple of years ago, and while there were some, I think, feathers that were ruffled in Moscow by, some of the statements that were part of that plan, I think overall from the Kremlin's perspective, it didn't really cross any Russian points of concern to really be putting the Russians in a more challenging position and to really sort of apply pressure on Russia. And so there's been this bit of delicate dance, again, where a lot of the support, as we've been talking about, has been coming in the form of commercial sales, energy, imports to China, and these military technical components. So when it comes to this new alignment and going forward, I mean, this is a really tricky question for Russia. Does Russia really want China to be more involved in this kind of fundamental, arguably the biggest question in European security? And, I think it will be a bit of a mixed bag going forward, where Russia is going to look to China to, back some of its positions and try to avoid the emergence of some kind of China-Europe discussion that excludes Russia. When I was in Beijing in the fall and had the pleasure of talking with Long and some of his colleagues and talking to a variety of Chinese scholars and officials, there was some interest at that point, and that was before our election, of some Chinese high-level outreach to Europe and some sort of, whether it's a contact group or a format to discuss sort of various scenarios to end the war. What was interesting is that, it was kind of a question of whether Russia and Ukraine would be part of that dialogue or if it would be more of a China, Europe, United States discussion among the non-direct parties, and then coming to the direct parties with some sort of conception of what the world kind of thinks, the settlement should look like. And I noticed that those discussions have sort of gone by the wayside, and my sense was that the Russians would have been a bit uncomfortable with the idea of, Chinese and European and maybe American officials sitting together and talking about the war without Russia there. So again, I think it's going to be a bit of a mixed bag and a tricky balancing act from Russia's perspective.
Long, you or Eric mentioned the 12-point peace plan, and the number one point in that is respect for territorial integrity, which China has long espoused and has recognized, I think, that Ukraine has right to its territorial integrity. Do you think China might be willing to use some of its influence with Russia, Xi with Putin, to try to advocate a bit for Ukraine to ensure that it keeps more of its territory that Russia has taken in the last 3 years?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misinterpretations about China's position regarding the sovereignty and territorial integrity, because I personally believe that China, Beijing has left almost zero ambiguity regarding the sovereignty and territorial integrity. Look back to what happened in Yugoslavia. We never recognized the Kosovo's independence. We never recognized the outcome from China, from the Russia-Georgian War in 2008, the independence of those two states, regions. We never recognized officially the Crimea, the status of Crimea as a part of Russia. So I think in the future, whatever the ceasefire or peace agreement could be reached, China would be very cautiously and will uphold our position, which support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity regarding those eastern part of Ukraine. But if it comes to the question whether China could do more, I think China has already been done so very much on from our official statement, from our positions at the UN Security Council and various platforms, reassured that all those disputes, all this disagreement regarding the territorial issues should be resolved through political and diplomatic way, not by military means. I think this is a quite strong argument here, and which reflect China's position. But if you ask me that whether China is willing to stand up and saying that we are totally against the controlled, those areas controlled by Russia, that Russia should give it back. No, look, we are not party directly involved. How could you expect China to say such things? And there's another argument is, I think Chinese approach is always goal-driven or goal-oriented approach. If such statement could resolve the problem and bring peace, I think China may consider. But if not, given the determination of Moscow, given the complexity of all those issues, I think it's really up to the direct party to decide.
What do you think, Pablo, and also perhaps bringing in the idea of China's galvanizing, using its position as leader of the global South, the other countries to sort of marshal an argument using moral suasion in this diplomatic arena?
Well, it's really a great description of, for me, the rationale of the Chinese position. Because not only in Ukraine, but in Europe, the question is, yes, China committed to key UN principles. It was always there. If we get back to this 12, I would not call it a peace plan. It's, it's a set of principles, 12 principles, because the plan is how we proceed to a set of actions and guarantees that these actions are taken or not taken. And it's a kind of vision. But in Europe, commitment to principles mean that in some moment in time, you need to figure out how to deliver on that. And the Chinese position is really kind of goal-oriented. It's sort of cautious and say, okay, if we can do something with that, maybe we can consider such a risk. And if we don't, let's not go for it. So it was a lot of fuss about the Chinese position, stating the principles, and after that, voting no on the resolution calling for the withdrawal of the Russian troops. But it's really important to have such conversation to understand what is behind these positions, the sort of rationale. Second, I believe that now China is, not in a different world. We are still in the same world, everybody of us. But in a kind of different reality where simply to commit to this 12 principle or 6-point plans does not work anymore. So it was something which was a kind of description of the Chinese position. But now the choice for China is either to start providing a sort of format or to engage in other formats. It's one set of decisions China has to go into. The second sense of decision, whether China can contribute on the ground. I mean, peacekeeping is tricky because how you deter the Russians with the help of the Chinese, how it all gonna play out. But I can really imagine the Chinese side to contribute, for example, to monitoring, to a kind of assessment missions. Of course, there should be Security Council resolutions for China. The point is, what kind of resolution? If it's the lowest denominator, it would basically constrain all participating parts, including China there. If it's something real, how you get to this real resolution with a real mandate. Not, of course, any fighting mandate. We are not talking about it. Not peacekeepers, not in the sense of Chapter 7 or even Chapter 6, but in the sense of China being present on the ground. And the third point, China probably would love to play a sort of leader in the non-Western world, and I'm saying non-Western world because I hate this bit of terminology about global South. I believe there is neither global nor South in the sense of this understanding. But it's also a turning point for China now because you can say, yes, we have a network of different projects, we have different formats, but if you need to act and if your choice is to act or not to act now in Ukraine, it's something which would probably define the Chinese role as a leader of the non-Western world now. I mean, not fully, of course. I'm not pretending to say that the Chinese stance would totally, depend on Ukraine. But if China decides to act on a point of European security, it would be groundbreaking. It would change China's perception, not only in Europe, but also in the non-Western world. But again, it would come with both risk and opportunities. And risks are here because how I understand the Chinese diplomacy, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, normally China has been trying to get prepared for everything and normally start acting if the probability of success is 90+%. I mean, it's more or less normal reality. Whether now the probability is 90+%, I'm not sure, because there are going to be ups and downs in the future situation. So indeed, it's a kind of groundbreaking decision now. But if China does not engage, everybody would say, okay, with all kind of hopes about China. China is still there, talking about, again,
What do you think, Long?
6 plans. Yeah?
In general, I think I agree with what Pablo just mentioned. But my concern here is I think Beijing nowadays is really trying to navigate the overall situation regarding Ukraine, especially the substance of interactions between Washington and Moscow. There's a lot of information that we should digest. And my concern here is whether President Trump is still interested in China's role in that so-called US-led peace process. Does it really want China to take over the helm? I'm not quite sure that in that direction. And my guess or my reading is that until when President Trump facing substantial obstacles that even fails in their talks with Russians, only at that time there will be much interesting in China's deep involvement in that process. And you also mentioned that it's up China to decide whether we should act, and they'll define China's role here. There's another concern is, as you correctly mentioned, China really values our credibility of our policies. So if there's still a huge numbers of uncertain factors, I think China will be very cautious to, take a step forward and to do something ambitious. Yeah.
Allusion to Trump. That's for you, Eric. What do you think? Do you think U.S. Trump administration, President Trump, is interested in having China be part of this peace process?
Well, as Long has noted, there have been some pretty confusing signals. On the one hand, you had President Trump's, statement that President Xi should get involved and help solve this, and it's within Xi's power to persuade Putin to end the war, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you have clearly developing a very strong, policy within the administration of competition with China and constraining China's role. And you have hawks like Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz and others that are going in that direction. And so, I do think it's largely unclear what, if any, role this administration expects China to play. But I wouldn't underestimate the possibility of, again, President Trump, who has taken a very unconventional approach to this kind of personal high-level diplomacy, as we saw in the first term with North Korea and so on, to convene some sort of meeting and do this kind of outreach, perhaps at odds with or in tension with some of the policies that his administration is pursuing when it comes to, sanctions and export controls on China and so on and so forth. So I think it's going to be a real challenge for officials in Beijing to really interpret what the U.S. intention here is. And, I think whereas the previous, the Biden administration, you had Jake Sullivan traveling and trying to test out Chinese positions and see whether China was willing to play a constructive role. And the Chinese response was, well, what's in it for us? I mean, you have all these policies that are harming our national interests, so are we going to have a broader U.S.-China dialogue? And that was, the previous framework. And I think now you're in, as Pablo was describing much more of a roller coaster period where you could have some very significant outreach from Trump and significant promises and maybe a real chance of some upside for China, but also huge risk, both in engaging and in not engaging. And I think that's where the challenge comes in just predicting the directionality of US policy here.
One of the sort of areas of interest now is, this week in fact, is critical minerals, right? We hear talk about deals forthcoming between Ukraine and the US in allowing the US to gain a sizable portion of the proceeds of Ukraine's critical minerals. Maybe there might even be a deal between the EU and Ukraine on this. What about China? Would China have any interest, do you think, in Ukraine's critical minerals? And if not, why not? So why?
Well, I think it's really, to be frank, it's really too early to say that all those post-war economic cooperation potentials. And from my perspective, whatever President Zelensky is coming to Washington by this week or next week to sign the agreement on the critical minerals, it seems to me that President Trump's really focusing on the policy of reimbursement of all U.S. investment in Europe, in particular in Ukraine. It's really confused me that how the Washington's policy could dramatically change over Ukraine and really only stick on those economic benefits rather than talking more broader pictures of a security guarantee or strategic stabilities in Europe. So I'm in status of shock, in fact. But I think Beijing may be interested in the future, let's say, to have a win-win cooperation with Ukraine, whatever it comes, whether it's infrastructure or minerals or other things. But I think the key question here is how we can pursue the peace and have so-called the just, lasting, and forcible peace agreement. I think this is the first thing that we should discuss.
Just wanted to ask you, Eric, given the strategic competition and the tensions you mentioned that are rising here with U.S. and China policy, do you think that the U.S. should ensure that Ukraine not give access to China to its critical minerals and resources, given the strategic competition? And do you think doing that might diminish China's willingness to help with reconstruction?
I mean, I think if the United States is going to put its foot down and make demands on the Ukrainian government to limit Chinese investment in the post-war economy, including critical minerals, then it has to be willing to give something significant to Ukraine in the process. We had this episode in the first Trump administration where there was a very concerted U.S. effort to block the sale of a major Ukrainian defense producer to a Chinese buyer, a manufacturer of aircraft engines. And I mean, at that time, it was, the United States was trying to identify a different buyer and so on and so forth, but this was all before the full-scale invasion, and the context was completely different. But I think Long is exactly right that we're sort of putting the cart before the horse and talking about, what is in fact a very exploitative arrangement of dividing up Ukraine's mineral resources and wealth as a method to compensate the United States for funds already provided, which
Could
is
that, though,
quite
in fact,
strange.
represent a form of security guarantee in the sense that if the U.S. has a sizable interest in Ukraine's critical wealth, it would want to protect those resources?
Well, I think that's what President Zelensky has been trying to negotiate in this process, that it's more of a forward-looking agreement about future security aid and involvement in Ukraine's economy, rather than this backward-looking, reimbursement policy, which makes no sense because when Congress appropriated the funds, there was no expectation of repayment. So, whether or not this discussion transitions into something more strategic rather than this just transactional approach that I think the White House has taken to date remains to be seen. And I agree completely with Long that, again, this economic component is a rather narrow construction, and we should really be talking about broader security arrangements, defense and deterrence, Ukraine's role in the European security order, the U.S. role in arming and equipping and training Ukraine, and so on and so forth. These are the bigger fundamental questions for Ukraine's security. And from that flows this kind of potential economic partnership to which China may want to have a role, and the United States may want to circumscribe that role somehow. But all of that is, in my view, for a far future discussion.
But in terms of the here and now, Pavlo, right, one thing that China is continuing to provide to Russia are components for tanks and munitions. It's granted dual use often components, but nonetheless, they have fueled Russia's war machine. Do you think that continued support affects China's claim of neutrality?
Well,
And would you like to see
it
it stop?
depends what kind of definition we assign to neutrality. The majority of Ukrainians don't see China part of this war, but don't see China also as neutral, because the stance of many Ukrainians is, of course, a very emotional one. And what could you expect when you are part of the war? But coming back to this issue about resources and Chinese policy, I mean, it would depend on where Ukraine belongs to. If we are part of the West, so there are constraints on further cooperation would cover Ukraine, of course. And the point for me, whether there are going to be overall Western constraints, agreed and negotiated between the United States, Europe, and some Asian countries, a kind of overall umbrella, or there are going to be different sets of constraints. I mean, one here in US, another one in Europe, another one in Japan or wherever. And there have been a lot of speculations, let's call them speculation, about a sort of trade-off between US and Europe, in the sense of Europe kind of raising the stakes on that, and US as a sort of this trade-off retaining its full presence in Europe. But I'm not totally skeptical on that, but I'm not reassured, at least by what has been going on here. So I would expect that China would be interested less in all kind of Ukrainian resources, but far more in three fundamental areas in Ukraine. One is critical infrastructure, because it's important also in the sense of big transit routes and supply chains. One of the most fundamental points. Second, Ukrainian agri-tech, and this cooperation is ongoing. But it's an important part of food security. And the third one, and I don't exclude it actually, with all kind of drive about military and military-related technologies now, on drones or AI and all kind of stuff, I mean, it's one of the most tricky areas where China, for me, would love to engage in Ukraine, but whether China could be allowed to engage by the West. It's one of the most critical points here. The Chinese militaries and Chinese scholars have been following what's going on in extreme detail in Ukraine, basically trying to understand it. So they understand the value, but also the sense of added value of Ukrainian potential. But for me, these are three fundamental areas where China could be interested to engage in Ukraine. And on these critical minerals and resources, yes, there are very interesting areas, but China is #1 producer of rare earths with great outreach around the world. Whether Ukraine could be something strategic for China, I'm not sure from everything I know here.
With a few minutes left, I'd like to get to a couple of questions from the audience. This is one that says, from a Chinese perspective, it is difficult to understand the European desire for China to abandon Russia when European countries are in the process of implementing tariffs on Chinese EVs and stepping up engagement in the South China Sea, an area China views as its core interest. Europe wants China to push back against Russia, but does not want to do anything to incentivize that action for China. Is there any opportunity for negotiation between European countries and China on linking Chinese concerns in Europe and the region to European concerns about China's interaction with Russia?
Before I answer that question, I really want to address what I mentioned before, the so-called somehow China is fueling Russia's war by providing those dual-use items. This is something really, I think a lot of Chinese are frustrated from this kind of argument because the dual-use item, by definition, that means could be used on the military purpose, but also on civilian purpose. China, when China is selling something, exporting something to Russia, it's almost, I couldn't imagine that how China could trace down all those components and goods, whether it be used on the battlefield or inside Russia. Because I've heard argument from our the European colleagues that China is selling thousands of those heavy trucks to Russia, and some of those components could be used on production for tanks. So how could you expect China to trace down all those things? But there's another example when, let's say, when people went to the CVS store here and bought the Caesar on his way back, he used that Caesar to attack someone and kill someone. How could you accuse the CVS store for selling Caesars? So I couldn't just understand. There's the logic behind that, but it's really, I think it's really unfair to judge China. Let's assume that China does not so-called have this more balanced and neutral position, and we could provide let's say, any kind of no limitations of weapon in terms of weapons to Russia. I don't think the battlefield would look like today. I think there will be fundamental changes on the battlefield. In fact, China showed the self-restraint on exporting some critical and sensitive components like drones, and we didn't provide any lethal weapons. This is for fact. Regarding the Europe, I think there's the answer will be very simple. I think China envision more strong so-called strategic independence of Europe. So Europe could view their relations with China only through the lens of bilateral concerns and interests, not to involve all those such multidimensional factors like China-Russian relationship, transatlantic relationship, and I think our relationship should build on really on our bilateral interest. In that sense, I think if we could expect a ceasefire in Ukraine, that will really ease a lot of obstacles, remove those obstacles, political, synthesis from that constructive cooperation between Europe and China.
Eric, how optimistic are you about President Trump reaching a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine in the short term? The Special Envoy Steve Witkoff on Sunday said that he thought the Istanbul framework could serve as a guidepost, which Russia likes because of its call for Ukraine permanent neutrality. And China, after all, is one of the 5 security guarantors under that plan. What do you think?
Well, by way of background for members of the audience, the Istanbul Framework was a set of negotiations that took place early in the war, first in Belarus and then in Turkey, where Ukrainian and Russian negotiators were talking about a variety of issues, including a security guarantee framework for Ukraine that would include the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, including China. These were Russian-Ukrainian talks, and neither China nor the United States nor France and UK were present in these discussions. So it was sort of questionable how it could ever be implemented. But like you say, Russia is a fan of this framework because the Russian demands on Ukraine at that point were pretty severe and a form of capitulation, by means of reducing significantly the capabilities and size of Ukraine's armed forces, military equipment, permanent neutrality, cutting off Ukraine's military cooperation with Western partners, and so on.
So you think it's a non-starter?
I think that's a non-starter for Ukraine. I think
despite what Witkoff says.
there's a lot of water under the bridge, and
Yeah. Ukraine
Ukraine is in a much stronger position now than it was in March 2022 to resist some of those really sweeping demands. Overall, I have a little bit more optimism that this kind of shakeup can at least start some conversations going that were frozen over the past 3 years, and maybe put Russia a bit on its back foot and force Russia to kind of play at least a notionally more constructive role in sort of suggesting that it's willing to entertain some sort of ceasefire. But I think the fundamental issue is that the interests of Russia and Ukraine are mutually exclusive at this point. And I don't think that these bigger fundamental issues that would be part of a peace settlement, like Ukraine's alignment and so on, are anywhere close to being resolved.
I think the other 2 panelists would agree. But one more question, if we have time long. What lessons has China taken away from Russia's invasion of Ukraine for its own neighborhood, including Taiwan? Is it that military force ultimately works, even if it's costly? Or that the West is more willing to push back against territorial expansion than Beijing had expected?
Wow, that question is really...
In 2 minutes.
Okay. Wow, that's almost a mission impossible for me. But I think I will put in this way. China never advocates to use the military approach to address security concerns. If you look at on the history of PRC, we are really reluctant to say that, let the weapons to decide. We always uphold the principle that all those disputes should be resolved through the diplomatic and the political way. But there's no lessons for China to learn because I think from Beijing's view, it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy for all. There's no winners. I don't see U.S. is winning. I don't see either Moscow's winning. Given the fact there's almost 1 million soldiers so dead or injured from both sides, not to mention those millions of refugees from Ukraine. So I think this is tragedy. I think there's a lesson for all of us to learn that if you take this decision to use military power to resolve some complex, very complex political issue or disputes, the outcome may not be you can receive as you expected. So I think there's a lesson for all of us to learn.
From your words to Xi Jinping's ears. I think we need to, we are right at time, so we're going to end here. And thank you, everyone, for your questions, your participation, and for being here. Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.